The forest was completely still, not the stillness of an empty place. Something else, a hell-breath kind of silence, the kind that makes the hairs on a man's forearm stand without any wind to explain it. He stopped moving, not because he heard something, because he stopped hearing everything. The other men noticed it too. They said nothing. They just stopped. 3 of them, standing in the dark between the trees, rifles across their chests, staring in the same direction without agreeing to. Whatever was out there, whatever they had all turned to face at exactly the same moment, they never found it. But they did not forget it either. And that is what makes this account different from most. If you find value in long-form historical documentary storytelling, we'd be grateful if you subscribed. It's the only way this kind of careful, research-based work continues to reach people who care about it. By the winter of 1944, the Western Front had settled into something that defied the clean narratives of strategic maps. The Allied advance through France had stalled. German forces had retreated into the dense forest belts along the German-Belgian border, the Hurtgen Forest in particular, and what followed was not the rapid liberation that military planners had hoped for. It was instead one of the longest, costliest, and most psychologically damaging campaigns in American military history. The Hurtgen Forest stretches across roughly 50 square miles of what is today Western Germany. The trees there are old growth, Scots pine and fir, planted in orderly rows by German foresters in the 19th century, so dense at their canopy that aerial reconnaissance struggled to penetrate them. At ground level, the forest floor sits in near constant shadow. Even in autumn, with some of the deciduous trees bare, the light that reached the ground was thin, gray, and unreliable. American soldiers entered this terrain in September of 1944 and did not leave until February of 1945. In those months, the forest swallowed units whole. Communication was poor. Supply lines were erratic. The cold arrived early and stayed. Men fought in mud that reached their knees, through minefields that had no clear boundaries, against an enemy that had spent months fortifying positions among the trees. The Army's official casualty figures for the Hurtgen campaign exceed 33,000 American soldiers, killed, wounded, or incapacitated by combat exhaustion, trench foot, and exposure. Military historians have since called it one of the most mismanaged engagements of the entire war. But the numbers do not fully capture what soldiers described about their experience inside the forest itself. Veterans who survived the Hurtgen spoke at length about the landscape's psychological character. The trees were too regular, they said, the rows too uniform. In daylight, you could see perhaps 30 meters before the trunks became indistinguishable from shadow. At night, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Sound traveled strangely. Sometimes a burst of enemy fire would seem to come from directly behind a man, only for the impact to fall 30 meters to his left. The official Army medical records from the campaign include documentation of what field surgeons called forest anxiety, a clinical term used loosely at the time to describe soldiers who became immobilized, unresponsive, or unable to function without any physical wound to explain their condition. One Army psychiatrist, writing in a post-war analysis, noted that the Hurtgen produced more cases of acute psychological breakdown per engaged unit than any other single engagement of a European theater. The official record, in other words, acknowledges something extraordinary happened to men in that forest. It simply does not fully account for what they said caused it. The stories that circulated among American soldiers during the Hurtgen campaign were not the kind of stories men typically shared. Combat veterans tend toward understatement. They describe what happened in the flattest possible terms, and they reserve embellishment for absurdity, not fear. These stories were different. They traveled through units that had no contact with one another. They surfaced in after-action debriefs in language that was careful, factual, stripped of drama. They were not ghost stories. They were not reported in the context of folklore or entertainment. They were reported the way a soldier reports any other tactical observation, as something that needed to be accounted for. The shared core of the reports was this. In the deeper sections of the forest, away from the established front lines, men described a presence that was not German. That particular word, presence, appears in multiple independent accounts from the period, often without elaboration. Soldiers used it the way they might describe the feeling before an artillery barrage. A weight in the air, an awareness, something that registered not as sound or sight, but as an instinct so strong it produced a physical response. Men described stopping without knowing why. They described turning, collectively, without anyone giving the order. They described an absolute silence that fell over areas of the forest that had been, moments before, alive with the ordinary sounds of wind and branch and animal movement. Several accounts describe a smell, not the familiar smell of decay or cordite or wet earth that soldiers in that theater knew well. Something older, they recalled, deeper. One veteran, interviewed decades later, used the phrase like the ground itself was breathing. Medics in forward positions reported soldiers returning from patrols in states of visible distress, not from combat, not from enemy contact, but from something they had encountered or, more precisely, felt in the interior of the forest. These men were not injured. They were not showing signs of acute psychological episodes. They were simply, according to one medic's written account, not able to tell me what happened. These reports span at least 4 separate American divisions that operated in the Hurtgen during the fall and winter of 1944. The units had different command structures, different entry points into the forest, and minimal communication with each other during the campaign. The similarities across unrelated groups are what make the pattern difficult to dismiss. What soldiers reported encountering in the Hurtgen was not consistent enough to be a single thing, but it was consistent enough to suggest a pattern. The accounts cluster around specific behaviors and specific conditions. It appeared, or was felt, most often at dusk or in the hours immediately before dawn. It was almost never reported in full daylight. It was almost never reported in open ground. It seemed, from the distribution of accounts, to be concentrated in the oldest and most densely canopied sections of the forest, areas where the trees had not been thinned by artillery and where the rows of pines were most regular, most enclosed, most silent. Men who reported the experience shared a common sequence of events. First, the silence, then the stillness, an absence of wind that several soldiers described as sudden and complete. Then the sensation of being watched. Then, in approximately a third of the accounts, movement. Not movement that could be seen directly. Movement at the periphery. Something that stayed just outside the range of clear vision. That shifted when men turned toward it. That was gone when a flashlight or flare was directed at it. No account describes a direct confrontation. No account describes a voice, a shape clearly seen, or a physical interaction. What the accounts do describe, consistently, is aftermath. Men who experienced it did not sleep well. They became withdrawn. Several requested transfer out of the forest. At least 2 soldiers, according to their unit's unofficial records, refused to re-enter a specific section of the Hurtgen after a night patrol and accepted the disciplinary consequences rather than return. The rational explanations for these reports are substantial, and we will address them. But there is one detail that complicates the simplest of those explanations. In 3 separate accounts from unconnected units, soldiers described the following. Whatever they had sensed or seen moving in the trees, it stopped when a specific threshold was crossed. Not a geographic threshold, not a ridge or a clearing or a road, but the edge of the area that had been shelled, where the artillery had fallen, where the trees were broken and the ground was torn. The presence, whatever it was, did not follow. That detail has not been explained to anyone's satisfaction. The earliest documented account from the Hurtgen campaign that fits this pattern comes from a small reconnaissance unit operating in the northern sector of the forest in October of 1944. The patrol was a standard 2-day mission for men tasked with mapping German positions along a creek bed approximately 3 miles inside the forest's interior. They went in on a Tuesday morning. They came back Thursday, 1 day early, without completing their objective. The patrol leader's written report, filed upon return, is notable for what it omits. It describes reaching the designated creek bed, observing no significant enemy activity, and deciding, in the patrol leader's words, that conditions were not suitable for continued operation. He requested the mission be reassigned. His commanding officer denied the request and ordered a debrief. In that debrief, which was recorded by a regimental clerk and later preserved in a veteran's personal archive rather than official military records, the patrol leader gave a more complete account. On the second night, the 4 men had set up a cold camp, no fire, minimal noise, in a section of forest that their maps indicated was unoccupied. Around 0200 hours, one of the men woke the others. He had heard something. They listened. They heard nothing. But they were all, within minutes, awake and alert in the way that combat veterans get alert, not from sound, but from something that precedes sound. They remained still for approximately 2 hours. At no point did they hear enemy movement, see enemy personnel, or come under fire. At no point did they identify any source for their alertness. But when dawn came, the patrol leader made the decision to return. He did not record his reasoning in the official report. In the debrief, he said only, "It did not feel like Germans." The 4 men returned to their lines. All 4 survived the war. 3 of the 4, in interviews conducted by military historians in the 1970s and 1980s, confirmed the broad details of the patrol leader's account. One of them, asked to elaborate on what he remembered, was quiet for a long moment before he said, "I remember that I was not afraid of being shot." That's not what it was. He did not elaborate further. Before continuing, it is important to acknowledge the context honestly. The conditions inside the Hurtgen forest during the fall and winter of 1944 were among the most psychologically extreme that American soldiers experienced during the entire Second World War. Sleep deprivation was nearly universal. Men in forward positions routinely went 4, 5, 6 days with fewer than 3 hours of sleep per night. The cold was consistent and severe. Trench foot was so prevalent that it was treated as a routine medical condition rather than an emergency. The forest density meant that artillery fire, both incoming and outgoing, echoed and redirected in ways that made accurate perception of direction nearly impossible. The psychological literature on extreme isolation and sleep deprivation is unambiguous. After 72 hours without adequate sleep, healthy adults begin experiencing perceptual distortions. Peripheral vision becomes unreliable. The brain, starved of normal sensory input, begins to generate its own. Objects move that are stationary. Sounds acquire sources that do not exist. The sense of being watched, documented extensively in survival psychology, is one of the most common symptoms of high-stress isolation. Add to this the well-documented phenomenon of hypervigilance in combat veterans. The brain trained by combat to interpret ambiguity as threat will, under sufficient stress, begin interpreting the absence of threat as threat. The silence of the forest would not have registered as safety to men who had spent months learning that silence often preceded artillery. These factors explain the majority of anomalous perceptual reports from the Hurtgen campaign. They explain individual accounts. They explain isolated incidents. They explain the psychological profile of men who returned from patrols in visible distress. They do not, however, fully explain why men who had no contact with one another produced accounts with the same specific details, the same sequence, the same threshold, the same aftermath. They do not explain why these reports clustered in specific sections of the forest rather than distributing evenly across all areas of equal stress and equal danger. and they do not explain why several of the men who produced these accounts were, by all other measures, among the most functionally stable in their units. The most detailed account from the Hurtgen Forest comes from a sergeant who served with an infantry division in the western sector of the campaign. He gave his account in a recorded interview conducted in 1983. He was in his early 60s at the time. He had not spoken publicly about his wartime service before that interview, and he did not speak about it again before his death in 1991. The interview runs approximately 40 minutes. What follows is drawn from the transcript. He described a night in late November 1944. His platoon had been ordered to hold a section of forest that had recently changed hands. They dug in along a ridge line, facing east toward German positions that were believed to be approximately 400 meters away through the trees. The first night was quiet. The second night was also quiet. He described the silence of the forest in terms that were careful and specific. He said the forest had two kinds of silence. The first was the silence of nothing happening. The second was different. He said, "You could tell when the second one came because the birds would stop." A clinical note here. Ornithologists who have studied bird behavior in conflict zones have documented that certain species do exhibit alarm behavior, sudden silence, in response to large, unfamiliar presences moving through their territory. This has been documented in relation to predator movement and has been observed in forests across Europe. The sergeant described the third night. Around midnight, the birds stopped. He said he noticed it before he was fully awake. He was lying in his foxhole and something in the quality of the air changed, and he was awake before he understood why. He looked at the man in the foxhole beside him. That man was already awake, already looking toward the trees. He said they did not speak. He said he raised his rifle, not because he heard anything, but because his hands did it before he decided to. For the next period of time, he estimated 40 minutes. Though he acknowledged his sense of time that night was unreliable, the platoon lay still. No one fired. No one spoke. No order was given to stand down, but eventually, the men began to lower their weapons without anyone telling them to. He paused in the interview for a long moment here. He said, whatever it was not interested in us. When the interviewer asked him to describe what he had seen, he said he had not seen anything clearly. He described movement in the trees at the edge of his vision. Consistent movement, not erratic, not the movement of wind and branches. He said it moved the way a large animal moves, deliberately, without hurry. He was asked if he thought it was an animal. He said, "No, I knew what animals sounded like in there. This didn't sound like anything." He was quiet again. He said, "It stopped about 30 meters out, right where the shells had come down the week before. It stopped there, and then he paused, and then it just wasn't there anymore." He did not describe it leaving. He described it being present, and then not being present, without transition. He was asked, at the end of the interview, what he believed it was. He said, "I don't believe it was anything. I don't have a word for it. I spent a long time thinking I should find a word for it. I don't think there is one." What makes the Hurtgen accounts harder to explain in purely contextual terms is that remarkably similar reports have emerged from other forested combat environments, separated by geography, culture, and decades. American soldiers operating in the Pacific Theater, particularly in the dense jungle terrain of New Guinea and the Philippine archipelago, produced a cluster of accounts beginning in 1943 that share structural similarities with the Hurtgen reports. The settings are completely different. The conditions are completely different. The cultural context, soldiers from different parts of the country with different backgrounds, is completely different. And yet the core elements repeat. The silence that is not absence. The sense of being observed without being able to locate the observer. The collective response, multiple men stopping, turning, reacting without coordination. The movement at the periphery. The threshold beyond which the presence does not cross. A Marine Corps veteran who served in the Philippines wrote in a letter home, a letter that his family preserved and later shared with a military historian, that his squad had encountered something in the jungle interior that watched us for 3 nights running and never came closer than the stream. He was not a man given to mysticism, his family noted. He wrote matter-of-factly about combat. He wrote about this as though it were a tactical observation. Reports from the Italian campaign, particularly from units operating in the Apennine Mountains during the winter of 1943 to 1944, include similar accounts. The terrain there is different, open ridgelines and stone forests, but the experiences described by soldiers are consistent with the pattern. The silence, the collective response, the presence that does not approach. A British officer who served in the Italian campaign and later wrote a memoir about his wartime experience devoted a single paragraph to what he called the nights on the mountain. He did not elaborate. He wrote, "There are things that happen in war that do not belong to the war. They belong to the place, and the place does not care that there is a war." He then moved on to the next chapter. The pattern across unrelated theaters, unrelated units, and unrelated cultural contexts is not proof of anything. But it is, at minimum, a pattern that deserves to be taken seriously as data. The scientific and psychological literature offers several serious candidate explanations for these accounts, and they deserve careful consideration. The most compelling environmental explanation involves infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that fall below the threshold of human hearing but are known to produce significant physiological effects. Infrasound at frequencies between 7 and 19 Hz has been shown, in controlled laboratory settings, to cause feelings of unease, the sense of a presence, and even peripheral visual disturbances. Natural sources of infrasound include dense forest canopy and wind, large geological formations, and certain weather patterns. The Hürtgen forest, with its uniform rows of tall pines, would theoretically be capable of generating infrasound under specific wind conditions. This could account for the sudden onset of unease, the collective nature of the experience, and the feeling of being watched. Almost. The accounts describe experiences in conditions of no wind, conditions specifically noted for their stillness. Infrasound generation by forest canopy requires air movement. Several of the most vivid accounts describe the phenomenon occurring in periods of complete atmospheric stillness. The psychological explanation that combat stress, sleep deprivation, and hypervigilance produced shared perceptual distortions is, as noted, the most parsimonious. It accounts for most of the data. What it does not account for is the specificity of the threshold, the boundary that appears across multiple independent accounts at the edge of artillery damage. Sleep deprivation does not produce consistent geographic hallucinations. Hypervigilance does not cause groups of unconnected men in different units to independently report the same physical boundary in the same physical location. The biological explanation that soldiers were encountering large animals, most likely European brown bears, which had population ranges that included the Hürtgen region, is worth examining. Bears are capable of moving through dense forest with remarkable silence. They would register as large peripheral movement. They would stop at specific points for reasons related to scent and territory. But brown bears do not produce coordinated group responses in trained soldiers who are experienced with animal movement. Bears do not stop consistently at the edge of disturbed ground across multiple encounters spanning months. And bear encounters in the territory where these events were reported would have generated physical evidence, tracks, scat, disturbance of vegetation that no account mentions finding. Each explanation almost works. None of them fully close the case. In the spring of 2004, a researcher at a university archive in Ohio was cataloging donated personal papers from a veteran of the 4th Infantry Division, one of the units most deeply involved in the Hürtgen campaign. Among the papers was a journal, handwritten, in the small and careful handwriting of a man who had clearly not written much before the war. The entries begin in July 1944, shortly before the division entered France. They are practical, observations about food, weather, the condition of his boots. The writing becomes slightly more interior as the summer progresses and the fighting intensifies. By the time the division enters the Hurtgen forest in September, the entries are shorter, more compressed. In mid-October, the entries stop for 9 days. When they resume, the handwriting has changed. It is the same hand, the letter formations, the pressure on the page, but the spacing is different. The lines are uneven in a way they were not before. The researcher noted, in her archival record, that the change in handwriting quality was consistent with what she had observed in other journals from men who had experienced significant trauma. The entry from the day the journal resumed reads, in full, "I am going to write this down so that I don't spend the rest of my life wondering if I imagined it. I did not imagine it. Hendricks was there, and he saw the same thing, and neither one of us has said a word about it since we got back. We both know what we saw. I am going to write it down, and I am going to put this book away." The next entry is 4 pages long. It is the longest entry in the journal. It was clearly written in a single sitting. The ink is consistent. The handwriting does not shift between paragraphs. He describes a patrol that went wrong, not in the sense of combat contact, but in the sense of disorientation. He and Hendricks had lost their bearings in a section of the forest that neither of them recognized, despite having operated in the area for weeks. The trees, he wrote, all looked the same. Every direction looked the same. They had been moving for what they estimated was 2 hours and had not found a landmark they recognized. He wrote that they stopped to rest and to try to determine their position. And then he wrote, "That's when I noticed the trees weren't moving." The entry slows here. The sentences become shorter. He wrote that there was a wind. He could feel it on his face. He could hear it. He thought, somewhere above the canopy. But the trees themselves were still. He looked at Hendricks. Hendricks was looking at the trees. He wrote, "He reached out and grabbed my arm." He wasn't looking at the trees anymore. He was looking past them. The writer does not describe what Hendricks was looking at. He writes that he turned to look. He writes that he saw it. He does not describe what it was. He writes, "There is no way to describe it that will sound like what it actually was." He writes that it was standing, that is the word he uses, standing, at the edge of what might have been a clearing, though he was not certain it was a clearing. He writes that it was still in the way that only things that know they've been seen can be still. He writes that he and Hendricks did not move for a period of time he cannot estimate. He writes that it did not move either. He writes, "It was patient." He writes that eventually, he does not know how long, it was not there anymore. As with the sergeant's account, there is no description of departure. It was there, and then it was not there. He writes, "We found our way back 20 minutes later. I don't know how. I couldn't have told you which direction the lines were in. And then I just knew." The last lines of that entry read, "I don't know what was in those trees. I don't know if it was something that has always been there or something that came because of the war. But it knew we were there long before we knew it was there. And it let us leave." He closes the entry with a single line. "I'm going to put this book away now. There are no more entries about the forest." The journal continues for another 6 months, chronicling the end of the war in the same practical, compressed language as the earlier sections. He writes about the German surrender. He writes about going home. He writes about his mother's cooking. He never mentions the forest again. What do we do with accounts like these? Military history is built on documentation, on the correspondence between what men reported and what the physical record confirms. Most of what happened in the Hurtgen forest in the winter of 1944 fits, however brutally, within the frameworks we have for understanding war. But some of it sits outside those frameworks. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, in the margin of a regimental debrief, in a journal page that a veteran never showed anyone, in the hesitation of an old man in a recorded interview, pausing before a sentence he spent 40 years trying to get right. It is possible that everything these men experienced has a rational explanation, that the cumulative weight of sleep deprivation and cold and danger and the particular character of that forest produced perceptions that felt absolutely real and were, in the neurological sense, absolutely real, but were generated from within rather than encountered from without. It is possible, but the forest itself is still there. The Hurtgen is a managed forest today. There are hiking trails. There are plaques marking where units entered and did not come out. Tourists walk the same ground where thousands of men spent the worst months of their lives. People who walk those trails sometimes describe, in the online reviews and travel forums where the modern world deposits its small observations, a quality of the place that they struggle to name. A heaviness, a feeling that the silence there is not quite like silence elsewhere. They are not veterans. They have not read the wartime accounts. They are people looking for a walk in the woods, noting, with mild surprise, that this particular patch of woods feels different from others. Perhaps that is nothing. Perhaps it is the weight of history that any site of great suffering carries, something projected onto the landscape by people who know what happened there. Perhaps. But the men who were there in 1944 did not know its history. They only knew what they felt. And they felt something. They are gone now, most of them. The voices that produced these accounts have been silent for decades. What remains is what they chose to write down, and the careful distance they kept between what they saw and what they were willing to say about it. That distance tells its own story. Some things that happen in extreme places, under extreme conditions, leave a mark that does not fully belong to the events that made it. They belong to the place, and the place does not forget.